Welcome to Church Pulse Weekly. It's Carey Nieuwhof here, and I am back with Mark Sayers. Welcome back as our guest host, co-host.
It's great to be back again.
Yeah, we had a fascinating conversation. If you missed the last episode, had a fascinating conversation just sort of getting Mark's take on almost a year of crisis and pandemic and the impact on his church and the impact on the church and some really good broad insights. But on this episode, Mark, I want to double down on networking. And just a reminder to those of you who are new to the podcast or haven't checked it out yet, you can get everything, like all kinds of resources on the digital church, the future church, and the future of evangelism by going to barna.com. A good place to start is barna.com/digital church. And I'm sure you'll find this episode helpful with Mark on board. But if you do, let us know on social and share it with your friends. And we're just so grateful for you. And this is our attempt to partner with you and try to figure out what all of this means. Because I don't know about you, Mark, you do a really good job of this. But, when I was lead pastor at our church, you want to do all this research, and yet it can be so time consuming and you're consumed with meetings and message prep. So I always appreciate the sort of meta ideas and the perspective and the deep reading that you bring to this. And you've got a whole series on your Rebuilders podcast that I'm an avid consumer of on networking. And so I want to explore that. So can you define what you mean by networking?
Yeah, I think most people would presume, or the image comes to their mind of going to a lunch and meeting other people who may be great contacts to meet. I'm talking about a bigger process that I think is one of the fundamental processes that's changing our world. I think in 2020 we've seen a number of things which have been really disruptive, from the pandemic. In Australia, we had bushfires, and many places around the world, from California to Argentina, have had bushfires and forest fires this year. To a lot of the political polarization, this movement which rapidly moved around the world for racial justice. So I guess the question I was thinking is, what's the big change behind this? And essentially, I would describe networking as the shift in the world to a networked world, where the primary way of organization is actually the network.
Yeah. Okay. So how does that actually play out? Let's start. I thought one of the interesting points you raised was on power and how power has really been diffused in a networked environment.
Yeah. Well, most people would be aware of, the revolution that happened in the world with the Reformation, where you had this centralization of power as it existed in the Catholic Church at that time. And then with the advent of the printing press and Martin Luther's sort of theses, nailed to the door, that then saw this diffusion of power. So if you can see these sort of two movements, one is there's periods of history where there's a centralization of power. And then there's periods where perhaps a new technology happens, people go on the move, and all of a sudden power is diffused. And so the world went from, after the Reformation, to this period of diffusing power, really up until sort of the 1800s, 1900s, where with the Industrial Revolution, revolution, the world had this centralization of power. Now, we've been living in that centralization of power. The probably height of it was the American century. But really, you start to see in the sort of 1960s, 1970s, power diffusing again. But then the internet has radically changed that. So, I sort of contrast it between the industrial age, where, power was in the big corporation, the big university, the big country, and the big church and big denomination, to now all of a sudden that power is less institutional. It's now spread through the network. And this is radically changing our world.
Yeah, it's interesting when you think about power, because it's easy to have a static view of history, but I would assume, like, is it fair to say, like, under the Roman Empire or previous empires, the Persian, the Babylonian Empire, the Egyptian Empire, power was highly centralized by a military political force, and then it kind of distributed to nation states in the Roman Catholic Church and the Protestant Church. It distributed, and even there wasn't one Protestant church, but many micro expressions of that faith. Then it re-centralized with urbanization and cities and institutions and corporations and antitrust in the 20th century, et cetera. And then the diffusion in the post-war era, right? So that's like a lot of sweeps. And often it's easy to think of history as a static thing, or that is the way it used to be. But you're arguing that we're in the middle of a massive sweep, a massive shift. So Talk about like technology and its impact on networking and the diffusion of power.
Yeah. So I think technology is influencing the world in two ways. One is jet travel,
Mm.
and it was really interesting. I read the two-volume biography of John Stott, and what just struck me is one of the things that John Stott did is he had, like, there was the Lausanne Covenant. He got these evangelical leaders from around the world to, meet and have this central understanding of what the evangelical faith was. That was only possible because they could all get on 747s and fly to somewhere like Lausanne. And so what you see there is the technology then changed the expression of the church and enabled the church to do particular things at a particular time. One of the big things we're seeing in the world that's changing our cities, changing the world, is migration. And so technology has enabled people to travel and get on planes. The fact that I, as an Australian, can fly to Canada, in 15 hours when it would have taken me a month by plane. Those concepts are radically changing the world. So globalization is driven by technology. But then the second element that's really changing the world is the internet, and particularly the internet, 2.0, which is social media. And what that has done is distributed power. I mean, the fact that we're talking to each other here in this sort of conversation, you're in Canada, I'm in Australia, and there's people all around the world, just shows that the way power is changed. Think about the impossibility of this conversation 15, 20 years ago. It just
Well, it
couldn't have
would have
happened.
taken a major broadcaster and millions of dollars and a studio. And even if it was going to be remote, it had to be live satellite, which was horribly expensive. And now it's a laptop or your phone.
And one of the paradigms that then happens is, before, you're right, it would have only been Christian ministries which had the funding to do something like that. So there was only a very small amount of them. But now there's just an unbelievable amount. Anyone with a phone can start broadcasting. So what that's done is it's changed the volume of information. So if you think about, in a consolidated era, the pastor, often, you go back a few hundred years, the pastor was the font of all information in a community. In England, often the pastor would be asked in the classic announcement part of, or the priest in the announcements part of the church, was also local news as well, because they were the person who provided the information. Now we have this incredible change where the pastor feels awash in this world of information, has people in their community who are fact checking their sermons. Dave Kinnaman talks about, like, your millennials, while you're preaching, are checking what you're saying on Google. You've got people who, all of a sudden, in Australia, we've seen people swept up into the US election. That would have never happened. It would have been this distanced, thing that you'd hear in the world news section of the newspaper 2 days later. So, information is awash in a networked world. And so I think a lot of these dynamics, pastors are sensing and leaders are sensing, but we don't understand the big mechanics behind it all.
Well, and you raise a really interesting point. It brought me back to, when I studied history at university, I remember looking at 19th century Toronto newspapers, and they would report the sermon. Like, that was a very popular thing in New York, LA, Chicago, I'm sure London, probably Sydney, Melbourne, where prominent local pastors, their sermons would be reprinted in the Sunday night or Monday edition. Or there would be a reporter there to say, Pastor Mark Sayers preached on Romans chapter 3. And that is inconceivable today, that a pastor would have that much power. I remember looking at Barna data recently in the last year that said, like, in 1990, pastors were one of the most respected professions in America and have fallen down the list so far. But is that an expression of the consolidation of power in that consolidated era? And we're kind of
Yes.
looking at, we've fallen off a cliff and what the heck happened?
Yeah. So Max Weber, who is the sociologist, talked about three types of authority. And one is traditional. So that would be the king or queen. So it's
Mm.
inherited authority. Could be a tribal chief. Then you have this other one, which is like legal or institutional authority. And so in a consolidated, industrialized world, if you were the preacher at that famous church in Toronto, who got their, sermon in a newspaper, you're at the
Yeah.
height and you had authority simply because of the role. But then he said there's another type of authority, which is charismatic authority, not as in the spiritual sense, but
Right.
someone whose personality, they garner attention. And so what this network world is doing is it's shifted power from the institutional power to charismatic power. It's boosted the ability. So if you're an engaging, funny person who's entertaining, you can now have a platform that's disconnected from the institution. So this is one of the profound changes that's happening. I mean, we could do a whole thing on the US election here that one of the things behind Donald Trump's ability is someone who had a Twitter handle, reality TV, was able to go around all of the usual institutional ways that someone would move to the presidency and go around it. So we're seeing this in the church as well, that, you may be a pastor of a church, and I've had pastors say this to me, and they're like, but all my people are listening to this blogger or that YouTuber, and I'm like having to do apologetics against that. So I think this is one of the ways that, particularly even this year, that this shift in power has like almost caught up on us, and we haven't realized what is happening.
Can you say more about that? Because I really feel like this is so deep that we need to pause on it for a moment. What does that feel like for the local church? Like, I mean, I grew up when I cut my teeth in ministry, people were saying denominational loyalty is gone, or now there's the whole question of questioning the value of a traditional education, right? You don't have to go to Harvard, you don't have to go to Princeton, you don't have to, you can do this, or the story of all these entrepreneurs who say, well, I dropped out of college and now I have a X $1 million company or $1 billion company or whatever. What is that actually looking like generationally? Like, you've got boomer leaders listening. Barnadata, I think the average pastor is about 57 years old, senior pastor, be a boomer. Got a lot of Gen X and millennial and Gen Z leaders who are also listening. So kind of run that through us generationally, because this is happening in real time. And so your 50-year-old boss may have a very different view of this than the 25-year-old associate.
I think there's a felt realities that people are sensing. And I think what's really interesting is even your boomers are still massively on Facebook and understand this dynamic. So, what you're seeing is that if you relied on your positional power to move things forward and your positional authority and your institutional authority, it's really hard to rely on that now. So that's number one. Like, let me just get that out there. If you're relying on that, that's not going to cut it anymore. Secondly, what it does is Anthony Giddens, the philosopher, said that what's happening in the world now is what was far is now close, and what was close is now far. And so, for example, as I said, the US election has been, huge news here. There was a Donald Trump march in Lagos, in Nigeria, like just this fascinating dynamics where the world is far. I was in Copenhagen, Denmark, and walked into the square there last year and saw this big celebration. And I'm like, what's going on? There's all these people cheering. And it was supporters of the BJP party in India celebrating Modi's win in Copenhagen. So what it means is that everything in the world is near you. So if you're a local church pastor, and just say, let's pick one. Let's say you're a Presbyterian. You think about how this worked 50 years ago. You had probably a denominational newspaper, you had denominational authorities, you had your denominational conference or, gathering point where you made decisions. And that was the information silo that you're in. Now in your church, the world is in your church, and you have every different denominational flavor in there. You have people who have got are doing DIY faith. So there's people like, I like this bit of the Christian thing, but I'm a bit new agey here, and I'm a hyper capitalist over here. So all of a sudden, what it means is ministry is less your people that you understand to now you're advocating. And again, you're almost like that Paul figure who's like, he doesn't come. And what's really interesting is when you see Paul is not coming like, hey, I'm the bishop here per se. Right. He's coming almost like, listen to me. Like, when I was with you, you saw me acting in this way.
It would be
very
different charismatic
yes.
understanding of power. Yeah.
I would actually differentiate it to say it's what the missing one in Weber's 3 types of power is, I would say, spiritual power.
Yeah. He had an authority that was not institutional.
Yes, or even charismatic. And, and he says, I didn't come with eloquence and human wisdom.
Right.
Charismatic is eloquence and human wisdom. And, I see the opportunity in this is, I don't think the answer then is a shift to charismatic power, because charismatic power inherently pulls apart institutions. And it creates this flash moment where we have these people who got 15 minutes of fame, as Andy Warhol said, and then they go. And we pin everything to them, and then they disappear. So you see these figures that have been hugely influential coming and going in the church scene. It's like it's speeding up people's sort of rise and falls in the church scene. So I think there's an opportunity at this moment to actually look to spiritual authority and spiritual power.
What does that look like?
Yes, it's where your authority is not emerging from you.
Hmm.
Institutional, or let's go back, traditional, and I think even it's worth saying there are people here who are probably listening in some context who maybe the pastor is the pastor because they come from this group of people or their parents were these people, and in different churches in the West and even various ethnic churches, that traditional authority is still there. I don't think that's what the Bible's talking about. We can't inherit, a heart after God. We pray that our children will have that, but we can't inherit that. The institutional, I think, position is all institutions begin to really move forward a move of God. If you look at so many institutions, they began with a moment where God touched history and people wanted to replicate that beyond one generation. So they create framework to do that. And so, but just being at the end of that chain doesn't mean you're connected to what happened at the beginning of that chain. And charismatic, again, too, it becomes about, at the end of the day, it's look at me, look at my personality, look at my intelligence, look at my ability with words. I see there's this element where this is a new form of leadership, where we understand that leadership is real, but what draws people is how God is working in my life versus what I'm doing, where I'm standing, or what I inherited.
And it's not necessarily tethered to institutional. It could come out of an institution. You could have a professor, you could have a denominational leader, you could have a bishop, you could have, a president of a convention or something who has that gift of spiritual leadership or charismatic leadership, but it is not necessarily tethered to the institution. Which
Yes,
makes the
yes.
dynamics, go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm agreeing. You continue. Yeah.
Yeah. Which makes the dynamics of congregational leadership even more interesting. So what does that mean on the ground in a congregational context? Because as we talked about last time, crisis is an accelerator. So all of a sudden, these people from your church, my church, they're all watching other pastors, or some are, but you're still their pastor. And, the internet is in their pocket. It's free. And they will continue to gravitate toward others who have spiritual or charismatic authority. So how do you lead a group like that?
I think when it goes to a digital form, I think spiritual authority can only equip. I think that in-person spiritual authority will draw people to you. So I think that charismatic will make you want to follow that person who's on that screen that you're not connected to. But I think the good news here is that when I don't know if you've had this experience where you've seen a leader and you've watched videos, you've read their books, and then you meet them and you're like, oh okay, that was a bit of there's
A
like,
little anticlimactic there. Yeah.
exactly. There's other people who, I heard about that person, didn't know them much, read their book, and then you meet them like, oh my goodness, this person is so alive with God and just drawn to them, and like this person is like Jesus. So there is a dynamic, I think, with spiritual authority that you can only really understand when you're in the presence of someone. So I think that anyone hearing this is like, oh man, how do I compete with all these wonderful preachers? There's something intangible and magnetic that when God has our hearts and we're allowing Him to move in us, that people are drawn, and that can only happen in person. Now, my hope, and I'm sure it's your hope too, that us as people who are doing this, translocationally with digital stuff, is my heart is that happens in those environments. I don't want everyone's pure spiritual experience to just listen to Marseille's podcasts. I want to equip people where they're at and inspire them on where they're at. So I think that's a differentiation.
Yeah. What would you say to a leader? And this isn't necessarily generational, but who would have, and because I hear from young leaders all the time, as you do, that, hey, I have this senior pastor, I have this leader who's kind of large and in charge, and, they're still operating off, I'm the pastor, you do as I say, almost that institutional framework or mindset. So if you're someone who kind of got caught in that and you realize, oh, I'm leading in that framework, any thoughts for that leader about how to move into a very different world?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of contextual individuality of what's happening in each situation. But I do think that sometimes God will get us to follow someone. and work in an institution, in a sense, to help us fight our own flesh. Because there's a lot
Mhm.
of frustration. There's a lot of learning to follow someone. One of the greatest skills as a leader is learning to follow another leader who you don't agree with. Now, I'm not saying a leader who's doing something immoral, but
Yeah.
like this is their vision. And, I look back at my development and I feel like sometimes I was accelerated when God said, follow this person, you disagree with them, you would do it differently yourself, but I'm going to ask you to follow them because I'm more interested in you learning how to follow than your particular view of what should happen here. I do think there is a point where you have to ask the question, is that person willing to release you? Like, and what does the future hold and all that? Those things need to be discerned and weighed up. But I think that there's an underestimation amongst many younger leaders that what is frustration is also preparation.
Hmm. That's a great word for younger leaders. What would you say to an older leader who kind of realizes, or someone who's just in that institutional authority, like, no wonder this isn't working out. I've been relying on my position. I've been relying on my affiliation. I've been relying on my education. I've been relying on my seniority or experience. And that's not resonating anymore. Any words for them
Mm,
about how to lead in this new reality?
mm. I see, one of the great maxims I think that I've, learned from others is, personal renewal leads to corporate change.
Hmm.
And, I think that there's something so inspiring when, I was listening to a sermon of someone yesterday who's a pastor who's got a successful church. And I was listening to them, and they talked about how in their sabbatical, God had done this incredible thing, this really raw thing, and how in this moment of suffering and doubt, God had just come through. I just sat there and I lost half an hour of time because I just was so listening to this sermon. And there's something inspiring when people see a leader who does have that positional institutional authority, but they're like, you know what, they're still going after God. They're still hungry to
Hmm.
learn. They're still open to what God wants to say. That's just dynamite, I think, in leadership, and people are drawn to that.
Well, networking is a multifaceted subject. So this is going to feel like a hard right or a hard left. But let's get into how is networking fueling tribalism and division in our culture? We live at a hyper divided and tribal moment. Is networking playing a role in that? And if so, how?
Yes. Well, decentralization naturally moves things from one big hub to lots of small hubs. So it drives tribalism. Um, and one of the things that I'm saying, which a few people are going, oh my goodness, is I feel where we've gotten to is what we were battling so much in the West was individualism.
Hmm.
And, that's been one of the big conversations. I've spoken a lot about that. And I've begun to realize whether we're getting to a kind of post individualism. And I think that one of the interesting things is that if you look at countries with high levels of individualism, they've done worse with the pandemic than you look at a lot of other cultures that actually have more of a communal sense. And so, in some sense, I think that 2020 is subverting individualism. And I think what's really, really interesting, if you look what's happening online at the moment, there's almost this progression you could go. You look at the last episode of Seinfeld, and that was the classic group of four individuals who, the final episode, they're in jail. And it was almost this like the whole of Seinfeld was almost like we're individuals now. We don't really care about anything. Where's the line? What can we laugh at? What can we not laugh at? And it was always pushing that line. And the final episode, they're in jail. They're trapped in their own individuality. And I think people have seen the end of that. So, how you look at all these different things that are happening online, from Black Lives Matter to Me Too, you're seeing these moral movements, but they're interesting. They're not necessarily coming top down, they're sort of almost networked. And there's often hashtags. So, there's this sense where people have come to the end of individualism. They're looking for a moral framework, but it's being driven by the network, which is really, really interesting. So our world has moved from I'm an individual, you do your thing, I'll do mine. We're re entering into this time, I think, of people discovering a religious sense, discovering a moral sense of the world. And there's natural clashes in that because when no one cares about anything, we're all just individuals. Hey, you do your thing, I'll do mine, let's all have a coffee. But we're almost, I think, returning to a form of a religious reality in the West. The second thing I would say too is everyone has a voice. That before, what would happen is you might talk to your family over a family dinner about the politics, and or you might chat to your neighbor or someone, at this restaurant sitting next to you. we can now broadcast to everyone. So everyone's a columnist, everyone's a pundit. And so it's just creating this, instead of like the network TV of 6 big megaphones, we now have 1 million megaphones. But I think this is, I think particularly in 2020, this sense has completely pulled the rug out from so many churches because they didn't realize that the division and tribalism was already underneath the surface and that this dynamic had changed. They saw it as a vertical conversation, but really what's taken over is the horizontal conversation.
Yeah, it really has changed congregational dynamics, because when we were all gathered, and then everybody, I think, pretty much had to take a break from gathering, whether that was weeks or months, or for many of us, we're still waiting to regather in person. But yeah, you move totally online and suddenly everyone has a voice. I was thinking as you were talking about, the old joke 10 years ago, 20 years ago was, what was the best thing for lunch after church? It was roast pastor, right? But you never heard those conversations. You didn't get real-time feedback, maybe the odd critic in the lobby or something like that, but you didn't really get it. Now everyone's more than happy to share their opinions on social or hashtag you or email you or whatever. A lot of leaders are living with just this bombardment of voices and opinions about what to do, when to regather, masks, no masks, what the government's up to, what to preach on next. How do you navigate those voices in a hyper divided world?
Yeah, I think that I find it really interesting that social media in some countries has turned off. Like social media companies have, I think it was in Sri Lanka after the bombings, they turned it off for 6 weeks. I think even in Spain, just before the elections, they turned it off. And I find that really interesting that if you've got a tool and you're the platform who are running that, and you know that it can be so divisive, you turn it off before an election or after a terrorist bombing. So there's an element that some of these tools enable us to do what we're doing here, but then also there's a significant downside, which means that there's a constant, there was a whole move amongst pastors, and maybe this is not every pastor, but pastors and priests who the whole man saw the church, the house next to the church. There was this whole move like, why would you do that? And you're just going to have people knocking on your door. I think what's happened with social media is we've moved back to the church and we've got an open door. And, and what's even worse is that people can turn up at 3 o'clock at night. And there's this sense where what it has done is it's decoupled it from in person. Now, pastors often would have that thing where someone needs to talk to you, and you meet with them in person, you get a sense of where they're coming from, and you can weigh that up, and there was institutional ways of dealing with that. And again, some institutional stuff was correct because it created processes that enabled you to deal with things with a proper and fair process. I would question, like, I would think, use it proportionally. We need to teach how to love each other online. And, we need to, if you're in a church and you're in an environment, in a context where that's happening, I would be preaching. Like, you don't have to preach on this issue or that issue, but how do we love each other online? We preach that on how do you do that in a dating relationship or a family relationship or with your kids. Let's talk about that digitally. How do you show grace and mercy and kindness and the fruit of the Spirit in a digital space? The second thing is, I'm starting to wonder whether visibility is the new fragility. That's with charismatic leadership. We thought we've got these platforms and it's boosted it, but we're now seeing the downside of that. And yes, it can boost, but the mental health effects that's having, we heard that with celebrities, and sports people who, were saying, yeah, I've got this profile, but I'm just getting trolled and bullied all the time. That's actually what's happening to pastors now in many places. Yeah. And so, I don't have all the answers, but I think we need to really begin to think about this. I mean, I also see that social media also can be a bellwether. I feel like what it's also done is almost this period of, perhaps the last 30 years was, hey, everyone sort of agrees. The context is sort of stable. So we can do some simple teaching around your finances, how to love your kids better, how to be more, at peace with yourself. And then all of a sudden I've got pastors sending me messages saying, I've got half the youth, in my church, and they're getting into this political philosophy versus the other half in this political philosophy. So there's an element, I think we have to get back to the bellwether of social media is reminding us to have a engagement with, I guess, the whole of life in our preaching, where we're weaving all of this stuff in and not just focusing on some lifestyle stuff, which I think was happening before. That's a big
Well,
answer.
no, it's a great answer. And I'm glad you touched on social media. So I don't know whether you've seen the Social Dilemma or you follow the work of Tristan Harris and others like him, but any thoughts on what the algorithm or that specific aspect of technology is doing to our tribalization, division, and polarization?
Yeah, look, it's undoubtedly fueling tribalization, the
Yeah.
algorithms.
Yeah.
My
And
suspect,
just
my suspect,
let's give a quick primer just in case anyone's
yeah,
not familiar with that. But when you say,
yeah.
how does the algorithm do that?
So in a sense that social media platforms want you to consume more things. They're selling attention and they're using your attention to sell that data then to companies who want to use that for marketing. So in a sense, as the saying goes, if it's free, you're the product.
Hmm.
So what they want to do is they want you to keep watching Netflix. They want you to keep watching YouTube, keep clicking on Twitter. So the algorithms, which is a complicated set of AI, then is able to see what you're looking at and then try and feed you stuff which continues you along the path that you've already begun. And the real sort of sense and pushback against things like YouTube has been that if you believe with, you might start with something around the environment, just a generalized thing. But then if you might go a little bit further here, maybe just questioning a little bit, but there's an inevitable extremism in any direction
Yeah,
that it
so
will
you
push you
get
into.
onto is climate change a hoax? And next thing you
Yes.
know, right? Or an example that Tristan would use is you're watching a World War II documentary and the thumbnail on YouTube, the suggest is the Holocaust a joke? Or and
Yes.
then you get into that. And because the idea is they serve you up slightly more extreme content because the radical views will get you to watch longer. And the algorithm's agnostic. It doesn't care as
Mm.
long as you watch.
Yes, and it's really, I mean, I think what we've also seen this year is I read when I did my book Strange Days, I talked about terrorism and Islamic jihadism, and I realized that some of the things that mosques were dealing with, where imams were dealing with young people in their mosque who were being radicalized through ISIS videos at an extremely quick rate, and there was even studies where people were radicalized, even some who were not Muslim, to Islamic jihadism in 6 weeks, and it was all through online video. And I began to just, as I, had pastors writing to me this year, began to realize this is some of what's happened politically for people. And, it's a whole subject we won't have time to go into now, but, things like QAnon, which has
QAnon,
been,
yeah.
if people are interested, I did a podcast with Christianity Today on that. But I realized there were people who came back from the pandemic and they had like a third of their church had been radicalized into this. So it's almost the rabbit hole where people go down and it's discipling them. And again, hats off to David Kinnaman, who, before the pandemic was talking about this concept with Mark Matlock in their book, Faith for Exiles, of digital Babylon. So the sense that the people have got it back in Babylon, in a sense, Babylon's in our pocket now. So I think social media is driving a whole amount of this. And, I have a sense that the digital platforms are changing a little bit now. I think the algorithms are already changing. And I think
Hmm.
some of the election stuff, it's going to be interesting going forward. But yeah, it's one of the biggest things discipling your people. It's the message I would say to leaders.
Yeah, and I don't know whether you heard Joe Rogan and Tristan Harris. That was a 3-hour podcast I listened to twice. But if you're familiar with his stuff, and part of it is like, how do you even begin to tackle this? Because
Mhm.
you're talking to the flat earthers, or you're talking to people who are in the into deep conspiracy theories. And that's why there's so little empathy. It's like, well, if you voted one way, Mark, and I voted the other, clearly you are not a thoughtful person.
Mhm.
Clearly you don't have good views. And you think exactly the same of me. You think, how could he be that unintelligent? I thought he went to school. Um, and so we really don't understand each other. Any thoughts on how you broker that conversation? And I've heard Yuval Harari talk about this, and Tristan
Mhm.
Harris and others, but they talk about agency, the ability to
Mhm.
know that you're the product, the ability to realize you're being hacked, the ability to make your own choices. How
Mhm.
do you broker that in a congregational context? Like, do you
Mhm.
just talking about it? Is it awareness? Like, what do you do?
Mhm. I think the first step is awareness. One thing that we realized probably 4 or 5 years ago was that anytime we talk about discipleship, we've got to talk about technology. that, technology, probably alongside the family is the biggest former of people now. So continually talking about it, so even just I will be preaching and give examples, like the people you're talking to, what you're seeing on your phone. I'm just continually dropping that in and helping my people be aware of the way that they're being shaped. I mean, one of the simplest things we did was the don't look at your phone for the first hour of the day. So we said, it's not just enough to have a quiet time, which Christians have often talked. Leave your phone at the other end of the house has been one of our big sort of mantras. And our term is win the day. You want to win the day where you're set on what the Holy Spirit wants for you that day, not what the algorithm wants for you. So I think there's awareness. I think also what we have is we have this incredible resource in a world where less and less people are meeting face to face. The church is still an environment where people meet face to face. And I think small groups, whatever you call them, growth groups at your church, chances for people to sit down and get to know each other. There was an interesting comment in one of the Australian papers here. It said it's no longer that it's about polarization as much as polarization is like two people who are disagreeing. It's now literally, I don't even see the other person as a human if they believe those things. And so to have people in the same room, and I wonder whether part of this has been accelerated because we haven't been in the same room as the church. And so, like once we're back in the same room and like, I disagree with that guy, but we're friends and actually, I'm listening to, okay, I hear that part of it. And I see it again too as if these things are coming into my church, it's going to make me preach and respond to things which I would have never thought about, before. So in a sense, it's a negative thing that comes in, but I want to reframe that and turn that to a positive thing and actually talk about, so I've thought about things like, Christian, like what's the role of health and justice? I'd never thought of that until this year.
Yeah.
Like, to protect people like I've never thought, there's people in my church who are, immuno, compromised. Never thought about them as a people who God loves. And how does a pastor, I protect those people? And what must it live like? Then it'd be to live like where you're constantly ill and sick. And so even preaching the health, I'd never thought about health until this year, but that's a conversation at the moment. So how do we as the church serve those who, physically are compromised in their health? Yeah.
Anything else on networking that we should be paying attention to as leaders? You got a whole series on it.
Yeah. I think the big thing, there's so much. I mean, we just started and we had to sort of keep it to, I think it was 5 or 6 episodes. It really is the paradigm. I think more is coming. I think this is just the beginning of a period of decentralization. When I look back at church history, when I look at the beginning of the early church, Rome was deeply centralized. When the gospel first goes out, it's actually a time where the empire is slowly beginning its decentralization. Battles over who is the Caesar. Rome will then go to like having 2 capitals, and Constantinople and Rome. There's decentralization has begun, and I think we're at a similar moment. So the sort of what the gospel was able to go out because of the infrastructure of the empire in the Roman road, the Roman mail system. But then it was decentralizing as all these different beliefs were coming in, mystery, religions, beliefs coming in from Egypt. There was this time where all of a sudden everything was up in the air. I think there's a profound similarity. I think about, the 18th century, the Great Awakenings that happened in the United Kingdom, in the US, was this time where people were on the move in the world. The new world was, being experienced by people. People were moving because of the Industrial Revolution in England. And when people move, they're open in ways that they're not normally. I think it was George Hunter who said, in evangelism, look for the gaps between idols when people are moving between 2 worlds. And I actually think that's happening in a profound way in the world at this point in time. We're in a gap between 2 idols. We're at the end of one age and the beginning of another. And I sort of embrace this age. The fact is, it's funny with the QAnon thing, like all of a sudden as a church, we felt like, what we believe is seemingly out there compared to the world. You've got people out in the world now who are believing stuff which seems more unbelievable, to many people than what the church is believing.
Than death and resurrection, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what I've said to people is it's almost like we've thought for ages, here's the church and then here's the unchurched culture. And it's this big static monolith. What's happening now is it's now we're back to one minority amongst a whole bunch of other minorities, and everyone feels like they're pressured. Like, conservatives feel like the world's going progressive. Progressives feel like there's this turn to the right. Like everyone feels like the world's against them. So I actually think we're returning to almost a more level playing field. And that's a weird thing to say when people feel like, persecution's on the rise. I actually think people are more open. So anytime that the world is under pressure and it's networking, so often they're the moments when great awakenings and revivals happen, if you're attuned to it.
So let's talk about the possibility as we sort of wind this down, Mark. But I'm thinking about a young leader who wants to start something, or a leader who wants to restart something or reposition their church for the future. What opportunity does networking present, this network world that we live in, present to them?
Yeah. I think we have tools to gather people like we couldn't gather people before. That, in a sense, if you're putting a vision out, you have a chance to connect with people, even cross locationally, which is an incredible thing. You also have an ability to network and see who around the world has a similar heart to what we're doing, to learn from them, to engage with them. That's an incredible opportunity. I think about missions. I'm here in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. I've got the Southern Hemisphere's biggest Sikh Gurdwara just over there. There's a Buddhist, community just over here. Indonesians, if I turn on Twitter of what everyone's in a close location saying, it's in Indonesian, not English. There is an incredible mission field that's come to us all around us. The world is close to us. So I would encourage leaders to look at that spirit. My view is that if you can plug spiritual authority into the network, it has an ability to go out in ways that are unimaginable. In a sense, institutional is bound in a particular place, but spiritual authority. And I think of Paul. Paul is moving around this empire, which is decentralizing, going to the Jewish diaspora, which was a network of people, and the ability for then the gospel to go out in a sort of viral way is incredible. And there's something magnetic about spiritual authority. And my hope is that young leaders hearing this will sense that there's something bigger happening in the world at the moment. Take it from me that there is so many young leaders around the world who feel that God wants to do something at this moment, who have been in preparation. Find those people. Don't just look at who's the charismatic or the institutional leaders, but find those with spiritual authority, hearts after God, and just begin talking. See what the Holy Spirit wants to do. Gather the people who are hungry at this time. I think the opportunities are limitless.
Wow. Well, I love ending on a note of hope. And I would seriously recommend, and I don't say this lightly, if you're interested in learning more about networking, there's 5 or 6 episodes. I think they're not all released yet on networking.
I think we've got one more to do. It could be 5 again. I'm not great on details.
Oh, that's awesome. And it's just Rebuilders Podcast. So you'll find that. Mark Sayers, thank you so much. We really appreciate your contribution to leadership. You're a voice that I really rely on and read and listen to regularly, and really grateful for your leadership. Thanks for helping us co-host. We will invite you back. So
it's been so much fun.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for watching and listening to Church Pulse Weekly this week. My name is Carey Nieuwhof. Hey, we would love for you to check out more. You can go to barna.com/digital church, and you can order the hybrid church, which has all kinds of data about the future church when it comes to digital and in person. And you can pre-order the new digital evangelism report. It's in partnership with Alpha. So you can find that all at barna.com/digital church. On behalf of David Kinnaman and Mark Sayers, thanks so much for joining us. And we'll catch you next